Without further ado, I'm going to give an attempt to introduce this extraordinary man. Before I go into the bio, which I've tried to summarize because it's amazing, it's epic. He's lived an epic lifestyle. In 2015, the year after I began advocating for drug policy reform with the concentration in cannabis legalization, which took 9 years of work, I organized a conference. It was at the Minneapolis Convention Center. I was working with this guy who was rich, but ended up being very crazy. So I had little resources and organized the Legalizing Minnesota Political Action Conference. And we invited Dr. Carl Hart to come be our keynote speaker. And when he showed up in the room, I mean, it's Minnesota. It was mostly white people. But he was shocked to see me and two other black people that I had on staff running that conference. And I want to say I'm very proud to be a part of Big Psych because we're intentional about including diversity here. You might have noticed that the black speakers are overrepresented, and that's on purpose. So it's full circle for me to welcome Dr. Carl Hart on this stage today with Big Psych, my favorite all-time organization. You know, but let me tell you a little bit about him if you don't know him. And this man is, you know, he's doing some very powerful, difficult work that I don't think he really enjoys traveling around the world, but we all benefit from his powerful truth-telling. So Dr. Carl Hart is the Mamie Phipps Clark Professor at Columbia University. It's an Ivy League school, where he's a black man in an Ivy League school, imagine that, where he's been on faculty for the past 24 years. He holds appointments in the departments of psychology and psychiatry, and he's a research scientist at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. He served as the chair of the Department of Psychology between 2016 and 2019, becoming the first and only African-American to hold that position. Hart has published 3 books and more than 100 scientific articles in the area of neuropsychopharmacology, and he's recognized as one of the world's preeminent experts on the topic. That's a lot of pressure. His textbook, Drugs, Society, and Human Behavior, remains a market-leading standard for many entry-level university courses on drugs and behavior. His autobiography, High Price, A Neuroscientist's Journey of Self-Discovery, that challenges everything you know about drugs and society, and most people got it wrong. It was the 2014 winner of the Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. His most recent book, Drug Use for Grown-Ups, Chasing Liberty in the Land of Fear, has sparked a more nuanced national conversation on the topic. His research is highly, and I couldn't even list all of the actual sources, so I'm summarizing, all right? But his research is highly cited by many other scientists. He's been profiled in the top medical journal, The Lancet, and many other popular media. Fast Company magazine recognized him as one of the most creative 100 people. That's a big deal. He's appeared on numerous podcasts, television shows, and radio programs. He's appeared in several documentary films on drugs. He's lectured on the topics of drugs, science, and race all around the globe. Probably most of his peers don't like to talk about race, so that's why he's so powerful. He's been recognized for excellence in teaching at Columbia University with the highest teaching award. He's met and discussed human rights issues with public officials from several countries. He's testified before the U.S. Congress, the New York State Legislature, and federal courts as an expert drug witness. He served on the editorial board of multiple scientific journals. He served on the board of many major, board of directors of many major nonprofits. He's given talks around the world. And he showed up here tonight because last fall, Jade and Steve got on the stage at the National Psychedelic Conference, and I was in the audience. I was the big brother making the proud cell phone video. But they testified in Dr. Hart's, at an event honoring Dr. Hart, about how they had traveled the country going to these different conferences and were like repeatedly let down by a bunch of these scientists. But Dr. Hart was such a he was such a different type of truth teller, very encouraging. So let's please give Dr. Carl Hart a warm welcome. Stand on your feet, please. Stand up, stand up, stand up.
Marcus, thank you, man. You didn't have to read all that. I get bored listening to it, frankly. Thank you all for coming. I know you could be somewhere like in church, and you decided to be here. So thank you. Thank you for being here. So I just want to thank Jay and Steve. Thank you for inviting me. I really do try to show up for people like you guys who are just genuine folks who care about other people and who are trying to do the right thing to respect and see other people's humanity. That's all that really matters to me. This whole thing about like drug policy, I don't give a fuck about drug policy. I don't care about any of that kind of stuff. I only care that you respect other people's humanity. I used to think it was about drug policy. I used to think it was about racism and all this sort of stuff. Of course, all that stuff it still happens in our society, but it's very simple. We've laid it out in our founding documents. We guarantee at least three birthrights to people: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Our job is just to protect people's basic birthrights. That's it. It becomes really simple. If you're not working on behalf of those goals, then what are you doing? That's how I see it. Okay? And then so what I like to try to do today is show you how I got to this place, because I wasn't always at this place. I used to believe very differently than what I believe now. And so the title of the talk today is High Price, Standing Up for the Least Among Us is Often Costly. There are people in our society who think that they're going to be, I don't know, what's the phrase that you all use today? Allies? Whatever bullshit they use, whatever it is. They think that you know, you're going to be an ally and it ain't going to be costly. It costs. You know, it is hard doing work on behalf of the least among us. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to do the work. Like people say, you know, there are risks involved. Life is not without risk. In fact, those risks make it so satisfying once you accomplish what you need to accomplish. And so when people start talking about the risk and they're not doing something because of the risk, I don't have much time for that. I don't have much time for you. So I'm going to help you to understand how I got to this place. I got to this place. It took a long time to get to this place because I didn't have people to, thank you, Rich. I didn't have people like me to say clearly what's right and what's wrong about these things. I'm going to take you all, if you would, come back with me back to 1984, damn near 40 years ago. When I graduated from high school, I went into the military. And I put this up not for that nonsense patriotic shit that we have going on in the society where people say, thank you for your service, and don't even know what I did. Like, most of us are not infantry. We're not actually in battle. And people say, thank you for your service. Nonsense. And so 1984, I was in the military from 84 to 88. And part of that, I also was a cop in the military. Again, really dumb, stupid, easy work. And people say, thank you for your service, right? And so I say this just so you know, when I am critical of society's unthinking compliment or unthinking elevation of that career field, I'm criticizing it from an insider perspective. And it's not that I'm not patriotic or anything like that. Patriotism really is protecting people's birthrights, not this other nonsense, whatever else you all are talking about. That's real patriotism, supporting the actual goals of the Declaration of Independence. So, but at that time, back in the 80s, I didn't know this. You know, I didn't even know really what the Declaration of Independence said, because they made us read it like when we were 7 or so. It talked about liberty and those things. It didn't matter because you were a kid. You didn't have any liberty. So it didn't really matter. And it only becomes important when you become an adult and you want to do some things that you want to do. Well, anyway, after I got out of the military in the late 80s, the big problem in the country, at least we thought the big problem was crack cocaine. So we thought that crack was destroying various communities. And so I thought, well, I want to make a contribution to my community. This thing, I'm sorry, I'm having problems with this thing. But the big problem was crack. And at the time, what happened in the country is that we passed these laws that punish crack cocaine 100 times more harshly than powder cocaine. That is, if you have small amounts of crack, a nickel, the size of a nickel, would land you in jail for 5 years, whereas it would require 100 times more crack powder to get that same sentence. Now, this law, when it was passed in 1986 and extended in 1988, I just want to point out that our current president, Joe Biden, he was a co-sponsor of that bill. You know, and I point this out, we all make mistakes, but I pointed out to highlight him and his troubles with his son, and the Republicans going after his son for his cocaine use and so forth. And so you see these things come full circle and the irony of all of these things. So that's why I pointed out. Now, at the time, also, George Bush I was president, and George Bush I in '89, he convinced the country that crack and drug abuse in general was the #1 problem facing our country. Now, not homelessness, not the environment, not employment, unemployment, none of that. Drugs. 60-some% of the American adult population said that drugs was the #1 problem facing the United States. He convinced the country of this. Do you all know that? You all feel me? He convinced the country of this. We actually believe this, right? And so, and Biden, what he also said, that it was the #1 threat to our national security. We all believed it, and so I thought I wanted to make a contribution to the society, and one way I can do that was work on drugs, and that's what I did. So this is sort of an evolution of my career, right? My demeanor was I was eager, I was excited, ready to try and figure out the neurobiological mechanisms that were responsible for drug addiction. I was excited. My motto was, I don't come to bow, I come to conquer. My aspirations was that I was going to win a Nobel Prize at one of these Ivy League institutions. My relationship with the country was patriotic. Each experiment I thought was going to be a Nature paper, some big paper, and I was preparing for the big interview the night before. You know, I was ready. Now, in drugs, the main sort of perspective was that drug addiction was a brain disease. And this was articulated by the guy who was the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse in the 90s. His name was Alan Leshner. Leshner wrote that addiction is tied to changes in brain structure and function is what makes it fundamentally a brain disease. Bottom line, drugs were bad. They destroyed your brain, and I was a true believer. I thought, I'm going to figure out how drugs are destroying people's brains, and I'm going to contribute. And that's what I did. I I went on to publish papers like this one here. This was one of my first author papers that I published in the Journal of Neurochemistry, looking at dopamine. I was really trained to be like a dopamine expert on the effects of drugs on dopamine, and this paper was called Nicotine's Effects on Dopamine Clearance in a Rat Nucleus Accumbens. So put a probe in the rat brain, and we studied all these drugs and see what effect it had, these drugs had on dopamine. And I was telling Reggie earlier how I'm embarrassed by some of the things that I said in these papers. Now, I said in this paper, like we were providing clues about nicotine addiction, for example. I said about cocaine in other papers, and you know, really what I was doing was I put a probe in the brains of an anesthetized rat and looking at dopamine signals. It doesn't tell you anything about nicotine addiction. But I was allowed to make all of these claims about addiction based on this nonsense. It's not, I want to make it clear that it's important that people do basic science to figure out, for example, how nicotine interacts with dopamine. We figured out, at the time, people were thinking that nicotine had a similar effect as cocaine by blocking the reuptake of dopamine, but actually nicotine stimulated it. It facilitated the reuptake in our sort of preparation, and that's important to know, basic sort of science information. The problem is when you start to extrapolate into human behavior and addiction and all these things that has nothing to do with what we did. And we did this quite a bit. And science, even today, continues to make these kind of mistakes. You all understand what I mean when the way I over-extrapolate it? You guys get it? I'm trying to use myself so you understand that I know I am fallible. And so when I point out other people's sort of error of their ways, I want people to understand that bring it with me too, because the goal is to be better, right? So this is like in the first decade of my career, and then in the background, kind of in my career, it's this thing about crack and powder cocaine. I also was learning that crack and powder are essentially the same drug. The only difference is in the red circle that I circled, there's a hydrochloride portion on powder cocaine that you have to remove if you want to smoke the substance. And other than that, they are the same drug. And that hydrochloride portion does not contribute to the biological activity of cocaine. So they're essentially the same drug. So I'm learning this. It's in the background, but I'm still being indoctrinated into this sort of drugs are bad and this whole brain babble stuff. So, and another sort of thing that's in the background too is that I'm learning that the people who are primarily being affected by the federal cocaine policy are black people in terms of who's being arrested and prosecuted. So 90% or more of the people who were being prosecuted under these laws were black. So that's 90%. Now, black people did not make up the majority of crack users, although you wouldn't know this if you watched your television news or if you watched New Jack City or some other bullshit movie. You watch these awful sort of portrayals, you wouldn't know it. But the data, I mean, just think about the sheer numbers of black people in the country versus just white folks. There's no way that black people would be the majority of users of anything. But that's not what happened in terms of who was being punished. So this is all in the background still. I'm not doing anything about this. I'm still moving forward with my career. And so now, let's go to another decade. As this is in the background, I am, my demeanor has changed. I'm now battle hardened. My motto has changed. Life is a marathon, not a sprint. Now I'm just trying to survive, And then my relationship with the country is disappointed. I'm starting to learn that we are not the people who we say we are. And you know, it's like I'm 30-something, maybe 40, and it's like you just learning that. It's like I'm constantly disappointed because I'm also constantly optimistic that we will do the right thing. But I'm learning that, nope, I'm disappointed. And so now each experiment is just another sort of study to put on my CV so I can get promoted and get tenured. And most nights I was in the office working hard, sleep, or sleeping in the office. But even though my demeanor's changed and things are changing for me, my career is going extremely well. I have multiple big R01. These are the biggest NIH grants. I have multiple grants. I'm on grant review committees. I even chair the grant review committee. I got tenured. For you all who don't know what tenure means that you get this evaluation, and then if you pass this sort of evaluation, you have a job for life. Unless, of course, if you get caught by me too, or something like that. But you have a job for life, and got promoted, doing really well. While all of this other stuff is going on in the country. And I'm still thinking about, like, what are we doing with our drug policies? Every day in the lab, I'm giving drugs to people. My research, for example, looked at cannabis, crack cocaine, amphetamines. I gave these drugs to people every day in the lab without incident. But yet, the national discourse, the national narrative was how horrible these drugs are. But yet, the taxpayers are paying us millions of dollars each year to do these studies where we actually give people the drugs. It's like, wait, if these drugs are so bad, why are we taking tax dollars money to give them to people? You all with me? All right, okay. And so, so I'm having this kind of cognitive dissonance going on. Now, I'm not going to say much about the papers, but I just want you to know that there were many papers that we published. I won't say much about the papers. You can just do a PubMed or a Google, and you can see those papers. But the point is, every day we were giving people these drugs in the lab without incident. And our empirical evidence radically differed from the national narrative on drugs. And we are the experts, and it's in the scientific literature, but it doesn't seem to matter. And then I'm also thinking about this policy question that's still nagging at me, because our laws still punish crack cocaine 100 times more harshly than powder cocaine. And I know my people are the ones who are the target, the ones who are suffering. And I'm doing work where I'm giving crack to people every day in the lab. And my colleagues and everybody, no cognitive dissonance. They're cool. And so it's like, am I communicating this right? You all get this? Okay. Right on. So this is like 2006. In 2007, along comes this cat who's running for president. Barack Obama, speaking to a group of people at Howard University, said, about this differential treatment of crack and powder. He said, judges think it's wrong, Republicans think it's wrong, Democrats think that it's wrong, and yet it's been approved by Republicans and Democratic presidents because no one has been willing to brave the politics and make it right. That will end when I am president. Judging from the reaction, you all know, I was going to say, what do you think happened? What do you think happened? What happened? Did it change? Kind of, right? So the Obama administration, they decreased the disparity from 100 to 1 to 20 to 1. So crack now is punished 20 times more harshly than powder cocaine. Now, I just want to be clear, the sort of scientific justification does not support that. It should be 1-to-1. And the Sentencing Commission, these are the folks who decide what penalties should be in the country, they have argued for more than 20 years that it should be 1-to-1. But the Obama administration, they negotiated this away, and it's 20-to-1. So I think Malcolm X spoke most beautifully to this, posthumously, of course, when he said that if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress, right? It's not any progress. Now, we understand that in politics that sometimes you have to compromise but you're going to keep pushing for it until you get it right. The problem here is that the Obama administration act like this was a victory and left it, and that was it, and they moved on. That's the real problem. The fact that you negotiate, okay, but you got to stay with it. But they tried to sell it to the public like it was the goal, like it's the victory. And then, so I think James Baldwin spoke best to this. When Baldwin talked about liberals disparagingly, Baldwin said that they have all the proper attitudes, but they have no real convictions. And when the chips are down and you expect them to deliver on what you thought they felt, they somehow are not there. This is the problem with the liberals. We act like we all have the same skin in the game. We don't. And so it's not necessary that you won't feel it because you don't have that skin in the game. But I just want you to be suspect until people prove themselves that they are really down. It's about people's rights. And so that's the real concern about the liberals. The convictions are there, the verbal behavior are there, but the actual behavior, that's something different. Now, this knowledge, of course, is weighing heavily on me, and it has changed my perspective, of course. And so when I think about now my demeanor, I'm traumatized like a motherfucker. I am traumatized. I try not to do public spaces as much anymore. I think my motto is I try not to engage with people who don't respect evidence. It's just too hard. You know, I've been doing this for like 30 years now, and I think of it like people who do that are as vampires, and they're sucking me, you know, and so I'm trying to avoid the vampires. My career aspirations are very simple as I started. I just want to make sure that I do right by people's humanity. I respect their humanity. I show up for their humanity to make sure that they have these 3 birthrights, even if they're engaging in behavior that I don't like. As long as they are not preventing other people from enjoying those 3 birthrights, I don't care. I mean, they have the right to even harm themselves if that's what they choose. But the point is that my goal, I'm just trying to show up for people's humanity. And that's how it becomes really simple for me. Now, in terms of my relationship with the country, I live outside of the country about 6 months out of the year. Otherwise, I don't know if I could take it, the hypocrisy in our country. But I have to live here because this is my country. My blood, sweat, and tears, my ancestors' blood, sweat, and tears are in this soil. And so I'm not just gonna leave it, but I have to leave it at least 6 months in order to come back reinvigorated and rejuvenated, ready to fight some more. Now, when I think about what's the goal of my experiments that I do these days, the goal is try to collect data to continue to undermine this thing we call the war on drugs. And when I say the war on drugs, it's just mean U.S. drug policy. That's the war on drugs, because the U.S. drug policy is basically a jobs program to keep people employed. I don't care if you are a cop, or you're a harm reduction worker, or you're a physician, you're all in this thing, this jobs program. Particularly when you think about drugs and from this sort of negative slant, which I will talk about in a second. This negative slant has been really promulgated or promoted by the National Institute on Drug Abuse. I think about their mission until very recently, and I say this, by the way, I was on their council, that is their advisory board. So this criticism I said while I was on their board. So I'm not just saying this to you, I said to them, and I was a part of it. And so this criticism is this, it's very simple. Their mission for years was to lead the nation in bringing the power of science to bear on drug abuse and drug addiction. That's pathology. Abuse and addiction is pathology. The vast majority of people who use drugs don't experience those pathology. But the National Institute on Drug Abuse funds 80% or more of the world's research with these drugs. And if they're focusing exclusively on pathology, then what do you think gets published in the scientific literature, in the textbooks, in your newspaper articles, in your media, in your awful films about drugs? Damn near every film about drug gets it wrong, in part because of this mission. This mission, why this mission is so important is because they fund so much research. And if you're going to get funding, because you need the funding in order to get promoted, to get tenure and all this sort of stuff, this funding dictates this narrow pathological perspective. Y'all get it? So the incentives are out of whack. As Upton Sinclair has said, it's difficult to get a man, in this case, since the director of the Institute now is a woman, Nora Volkow, it's difficult to get a man or a woman to understand something when his or her salary depends upon him or her not understanding it. You all see this, right? This is the major problem, these incentives. Now, in psychology, we call these things contingencies. The relationship between the behavior and the sort of the consequence of that behavior. And we know this very well. Everyone, this is basic psychology 101. And so we know that these incentives are out of whack. But behavior is determined strongly by these incentives, by these contingencies. We know this. This is not new. Okay, so now another problem is this sort of pathological almost focus on this brain babble nonsense. Now, when I say this brain babble nonsense, a lot of people like to talk about neuroimaging as if it shows us anything that's important about human behavior. Now, it's important for basic science, but when we think about like pathologies that people are concerned about or how people behave, we're not at that stage, people. But people believe it. But okay, let me take a step back. The DSM is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of the American Psychological Association. It is the Bible for diagnosing psychiatric disorders. Now, the DSM has in it, when you diagnose substance use disorder, addiction, it says an important characteristic of substance use disorders is an underlying change in brain circuits that may persist beyond detoxification, particularly in individuals with severe disorders. Now, this I highlighted in red, an underlying change in brain circuits. The only way you can know if there was a change is that if you image people at birth, before they start using drugs, to be able to measure this change. But this is in the Bible for diagnosing. It's illogical. You can't do this. But it remains in the Bible. This is the kind of illogical nonsense that's going on in the field when people have this sort of perspective that drugs are bad no matter what. Do you all see this? This is egregious. And anyway, earlier today, someone commented about Nora Volkow. Nora Volkow, the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Nora and I used to be friends back in the day. Nora is not a friend of people who care about other people's humanity and their rights. Let's just be clear about this. This is a statement that this was part of a paper that they published in the journal, in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is one of our top medical clinical journals. I'm going to read you this statement. Now, remember, this is a medical journal. You're supposed to have evidence to support your positions. In science, the only currency is evidence. Now, this is what this says. If early volunteer drug use goes undetected and unchecked, the resulting change in the brain can ultimately erode a person's ability to control the impulse to take addictive drugs. Now, there is no sort of differentiation between, recreational drugs use that's not problematic, which constitute the majority of drug use. This sort of statement is designed to make people paranoid about drug use in general. Now, and then the second part, this sort of erodes a person's ability, their ability to control. There is no empirical evidence to support that statement. But yet, this paper and others that Nora and her colleagues have published appear in our finest scientific journals because she is the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And she has the right political position. But in terms of a scientist, this does not pass muster. You all feel me? All right. Now, I want to point out that in 2012, one of the things that my colleagues and I did, we published a paper reviewing the literature, the entire literature on methamphetamine users who've had brain images and cognitive testing. Because we looked at methamphetamine because if you're going to see some neurotoxicity, it will be with the amphetamines. The amphetamines are much better at producing neurotoxicity. When I say neurotoxicity, I mean damaging brain cells or killing brain cells. The amphetamines are better than other recreational drugs, better than cocaine, better than heroin at damaging brain cells at extremely large doses far higher than humans usually take. So that's why we look at amphetamines, because if you're going to see some toxicity, that's where you would get it. So we reviewed the literature, and Nora Balkaw had some papers in this literature, and we pointed out that when you look at this literature, the methamphetamine users looked almost identical as the controls who never used any drugs in terms of their brain imaging. And then when you looked at their cognitive functioning, they performed dead smack in the middle for their age and educational match norm groups. But that's not what was said in the literature. The commentary, the discussion wildly diverged from the actual evidence. So if you get an opportunity, read this paper. And this paper, it was published in 2012, and it stands today, even today. Now, I'm saying these kind of things, which is really bold, and no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say it just to put you to clap. I'm only saying it to let you know that they came after me and they come for me. And the point is that I'm still standing and that they don't have any evidence to come at me with. Otherwise, believe you me, a black man saying these kind of things in an Ivy League institution everywhere I can scream on national television and so forth, I wouldn't have a job if this is not true, what I'm telling you. So believe you me that this is vetted. But don't trust me, go read the paper and read the literature and you'll see. And if you find some discrepancy, email me. Let's talk about it. So the point is that, trust me, they come at me. They come at me. But the evidence is the evidence. Okay, all right, since we're in this time, I'm gonna try and wrap up. Since we're in this moment in our history, I have to talk about this nonsense, the overdoses, right? People see this kind of thing. People see that one of the things that we do is that we, in this era, we have someone put up a slide like this, and then we talk about how bad the overdose crisis is, and then we say basically fentanyl is killing people, and without any thought to what goes into these numbers, without any thought about the veracity of the claims that are made about these numbers. And so I put this up because we're going to go through this we're going to talk about this for a second, because I'm sure you all have been misled about this too. But I want to say that it's important, before we talk about this, it's important for you all to know and remember that 3 years ago on Labor Day or Memorial Day, George Floyd was killed, right? And then when he was initially killed, they said it was a drug overdose. They said it was fentanyl that killed him. Luckily, somebody had a video camera, and we saw that George Floyd didn't die from drugs. George Floyd didn't die from heart disease. George Floyd died because Derek Chauvin's knee was on his neck, right? We saw that. But initially, they said that it was a drug overdose. Now, and so you would hope that the population would remember that when they see these overdose numbers and ask some simple questions. Just ask some simple, very simple questions about it. And I'll talk about that in a second. So now, before I start to talk about those data, I just want to point your attention to this paper that I published in the journal Neuron after George Floyd's death. And this paper basically was calling out people like me who are in science and who give these drugs to people every day in their labs and don't see these kind of effects that the population have been lied to about. And so I'm basically calling out those folks and saying that their silence is part of their complicity, that they're part of the problem as a result. So check out that paper if you will. Now let's go back to those overdose days. Okay, so whenever you see a graph, like the overdose graphs that I put up, we call that a line graph. Some dependent measure overdoses over a period of time. That's a line graph. Now, when you have a line graph, there are two important assumptions that must be met if you're going to show those data in that way. Those two assumptions are that the data are collected in an equivalent manner. That's one assumption. And another assumption is that your operational definition of that dependent measure does not change, that it stays equivalent. Both of those assumptions are wildly violated when we talk about overdoses. So now I will show you how those assumptions are violated. First, I have to tell you something about who is actually collecting these data. Who's collecting the data for the overdoses? Well, these data are basically taken from death certificates that are submitted to the CDC. Now, one of the things that happens is that if a drug is in the deceased's body at the time of death, then that might be considered a drug-related overdose. Or if the person who died is suspected of having a drug in their body in some cases. Can you all see how this might be problematic? When you think about objectivity, can you see this? Now, that's not even the worst part. When we think about who is actually who's filling out these death certificates? Well, typically when it comes to drug overdoses, it's medical examiners. These people have a medical degree and oftentimes some training in forensic pathology, and coroners. In order to be a coroner in most places in the United States, all you need is a high school diploma. A place like California, I believe they have something like 50-something counties. 49 of those counties, the head coroner is the sheriff, and their sheriffs have already, they've been caught engaging in shenanigans where they are concealing deaths that were police involved. I mean, this is in the public. And so these people, their qualifications vary widely. Their motivations vary widely. And also there are no national standards how we do this. Absolutely no national standards. The vast majority of people who collect overdose data are coroners because medical examiners are too expensive. I mean, like in Hennepin County, you guys have a medical examiner. But the surrounding counties, they probably just have some coroner who's the sheriff or the funeral home director person. So you can see how this might be problematic. And when we think about like, at what level does a drug need to rise in order to be toxic? That is so difficult to determine because you need to know whether the person was tolerant, not tolerant. This is never included on autopsies or death certificates or any of that sort of stuff. That information is not included. These folks who are doing this don't even think about this oftentimes. And then we think about the fact that multiple drugs are often in people's system when they die. Like if I die right now, I assure you, you will find about 4 or 5 drugs in my system. And I assure you, it won't be because of a drug overdose. But you'll find a number of drugs in my system. And then when we think about this potential funding influence, when we think about how these coroner's offices, these medical examiners' offices are underfunded, and now there are grants because of the overdose crises, and you can see the incentives to show how many overdoses you have in your little county so you can get some more money. Do you all see how the drug war continues and your complicity in this sort of thing by not asking questions? Just simple, basic questions. So, and then we miss an opportunity to like really nail down what's going on. Maybe there are some drug combinations that are more lethal than others. Maybe there is something that's related to some condition that might make it more lethal versus some other condition. We're missing that opportunity. We're missing the opportunity, for example, we think about something like Percocet. Percocet contains oxycodone, a little small amount, 5-10 milligrams, and about 500 milligrams of acetaminophen. Acetaminophen, in that case, it's far more potentially toxic than oxycodone. But the focus is on oxycodone. And we're missing the opportunity to tell people about the toxicity of acetaminophen to the liver or the potential toxicity. We're missing all of these educational opportunities. Now if we think about, I'm going to wrap up here quickly. Now, if you highlight kind of problems like the ones I did, it's incumbent upon you then to have some solutions, right? And so I have a few solutions that we can do. That's very simple, right? And so we can change the incentives. We change the incentives, you can change the behavior. So one incentive here, these contingencies, is that at the federal level in many states, they ban these things they call drug paraphernalia, like scales, like drug checking, all of these kind of things that help to keep people safe. Whenever you use drugs, you should know what dose you're taking. That's number one. That's number one. That's the first thing we do in the lab. We make sure we know what dose that we're giving. But that's banned. We can't have scales in our homes because it's against the law. This is sick. That's one way of changing it. Another way of changing it is to, for example, we can increase the availability of drug checking. And I don't mean test strips. I mean, this is so tiring. Drug checking with something like gas chromatography, something that gives you a complete chemical readout of what is in the substance. You know, when people talk about test strips, it's just remarkable that we are so low level. Places like Austria, Colombia, the Netherlands, of course, Switzerland, Spain, all of these places have drug checking where regular people can just submit small samples of their drug, 10 milligrams, and get a complete printout for free and anonymous. And we can't do it in our country. And we say stupid shit like we're the freest country in the world. Now, another thing we can do in terms of contingencies is that we can get rid of these policies that punish pure drug infractions more harshly. Now, one of the things that we worry about is drugs that are tainted with other potentially more harmful compounds, like some of the more potent fentanyl analogs. We worry about those a little more than others. Now, at the federal level, if you have something like pure methamphetamine versus having something like methamphetamine with some like fentanyl or some other substance in it, you're punished more harshly for having pure methamphetamine than you are if it's tainted. So it's better to have tainted drug in terms of punishment. This is sick. This goes against everything we know in psychology about controlling behavior or altering behavior. So these are some just basic, simple things that we can do in order to, if we really cared about this thing we call the overdose crisis. Very simple. Now, the reason why I'm harping on the overdose crisis so much is, I'm going to tie this back to the brain thing now, because now when we have this combined with this pathological focus on brain babble, this is where it leads us. Okay, so one of the things that the National Institute on Drug Abuse is funding, they're funding this study that is implanting electrodes, small electrodes into people's brains, in the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens has been said to be related to some pleasure center. That's a wildly oversimplification, but just for simplicity's sake, I'm saying this. So you implant, you have this electrode go down into people who meet criteria for a heroin use disorder. You implant this electrode and you stimulate it as part of the treatment. And the National Institute on Drug Abuse is funding this kind of brain surgery for treating heroin addiction. And the justification is that we have tried everything, and this is the last resort. Of course, that is not true. We haven't tried heroin maintenance, which has been shown to work for 25 years in places like Switzerland and other countries. We haven't done that. We don't even discuss that sort of thing. We don't even, it's not even a conversation. So we go to this level where you risk brain damage, because whenever you put in like an electrode in people's brain, you run the risk of damaging nerve cells in order to treat this behavior that we have, treatments that's far less evasive and better. This has not been proven to be effective. Now, the argument is that substance use disorders are analogous to other brain disorders like Parkinson's disease, like Alzheimer's. That's just simply not true. Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's are irreversible progressive disorders, meaning once you have them, they will progress to fatality in everyone. That's what happens. Substance use disorders are not like that. Another sort of point is the anatomy. You can brain image people who have substance use disorder. You can't see any pathology in people who have substance use disorder and differentiate them from people who don't, like you can in some cases with Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's. This is how sick we have become. And we act as if the risk to benefit ratios are the same for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and substance use disorder. They are not. So I'm going to finish up now, I promise. So my question I guess I'm going to leave you now with my sort of ask of you. Whenever I give a talk, I like to ask you all to do something, and I alluded to this. I'd like you all to fight on behalf of other people for their liberty, for their bodily autonomy, whether it's abortion, whether it's choosing to put a drug in their system, whether it's choosing to love somebody of the same sex, somebody of a different race, whatever. Fight for their bodily autonomy, their liberty. I'm asking this of you. And now, when I say fight, I want you to understand. I mean fight. This is not some intellectual exercise. It's a real battle, and it's awful, and it's costly. It certainly has it takes its toll on me. But the point is that future generations, my children, people look at me, they will look at you. It's like, what the fuck have you, what did you all do when you were here? And so that's why it's a fight, just like people fought before we were here. Fannie Lou Hamer, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, they all fought before we got here. But we act like what they did was an intellectual exercise. As Reggie reminded me, Fannie Lou Hamer, she was tied down and beaten. It's a fight. It's not some intellectual exercise. If you're here for that, this ain't the space. So now, what we're talking about is what we say we guarantee people in this country. And I like this quote by James Baldwin when he talks about this simple, basic quote. He said, when any white man in the world says, give me liberty or give me death, the entire white world applauds. When a black man says exactly the same thing, word for word, he is judged a criminal and treated like one. And anything possible and everything possible is done to make an example of this bad nigga so there won't be any more like him. This has been my experience. And when I'm talking about liberty, people say shit like, oh, you sound like a libertarian. Libertarian? This is American. This is a Declaration of Independence. So I want you all to go home and read the Declaration of Independence. Very short. It's a paragraph at most. Very short. And fight for people's liberty. That's what I need you to do. Another thing is that please read. You know, I'm really tired of engaging in the same dumb conversations with people who haven't read shit that I wrote, anything that I wrote. So please do me the respect. If you're going to have a conversation with me, at least have read something that I've written. And you all can do this. This is very simple. You can go home tonight, and if you turn on your TV, if you watch anything when drugs come up, I guarantee it will be wrong. And so what we can do, what you can do, is make sure you note that and challenge that. Call that out. When you're in conversations with people about drugs, they're going to say some dumb stuff about drugs. Like we're in this space, psychedelics. These people are the greatest violators of this. The psychedelic folks, they act as if psychedelics are somehow different from heroin or crack or something. Everybody's doing the same thing. They're altering their consciousness, and they have the right to do so. And when people start talking about, well, heroin's different, then you know you have someone who is not down with you. You have someone who is actually potentially an enemy. And I want to leave you with that, and thank you for your time. I don't know if you do questions or do, it's cool if you are, cool. All right, we'll do questions if we have any.
Please come up to this microphone if you have a question.
Please.
I've got a question for you. Can you explain, how the probe into the brain for that treatment against,
Heroin.
heroin,
Yeah.
how is that any different from, isn't that basically a modern day lobotomy? And could
Yeah, it's not as quite as harsh as a lobotomy. A lobotomy, what you do is intentionally disconnect. You kill connections. You break connections and essentially kill the cells intentionally. Here, what you're doing is you're trying to go down as slow as possible so you don't damage cells. And then you are trying to stimulate a specific targeted area. Whereas lobotomy, you're trying intentionally to disconnect parts of the brain. That's it. Okay.
Hi there, thank you. I was curious if you could elaborate, like you made the point that it's not an intellectual exercise, right? Like we gotta fight. And so much of your talk was focused on the intellectual misinformation, and when it comes to policy making and like you were talking about and encouraging us to do, correcting misinformation, seems like that intellectual work fixes in so heavily, but then you said it's not an intellectual exercise, and I wondered if you could elaborate on that.
Thank you. No, thank you for pointing that out. I think the question is like, yeah, how do you take this and move it into action kind of thing? And so, like one of the things that many of us have been misinformed about, we believe like talking to political officials is like doing work in terms of changing drug policy. It's not. The work happens when you talk to your family members, when you talk to your friends, when you talk to your communities, when you talk to your classes, when you talk to regular folk who vote. So you correct that misinformation. When comedians make these awful mistakes about drugs, when television writers or journalists make these mistakes, you write a letter to the editor, you call that out. That's part of educating the electorate. That's the most important thing, not the politician. The politician will follow the electorate.
Dr. Hart, thanks again for coming.
Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit about your personal experience over the last couple of years after you came out with Drug Use for Grown-Ups? I watched you on The Breakfast Club, and it kind of blew my mind the way that they treated you.
Yeah.
If you could just speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for asking that question. My personal experience, it's when there were some spaces I go to and people are hostile, and when I went on The Breakfast Club, they were hostile. I go to places like Brazil and all over the world, and then when the State Department started showing up at my talks and shit like that, it's like, I guess I'm on the radar now. And then when the Breakfast Club sort of questions are in line with some other interviewer questions, it's like, so this is kind of like coordinated kind of things. So the Breakfast Club folks didn't really want to hear the arguments. They just wanted to say that drugs were bad, and then as a result of me saying that drugs aren't the problem, that I'm bad as a result. And it was a hostile interview, but it showed the true colors of the people on The Breakfast Club. Mainly it was Charlemagne and that bitch-ass guy, what's his name? The DJ Envy. But Charlemagne called me. Charlemagne called me maybe 2 months ago. And so I'm going to go back on The Breakfast Club. And Charlemagne has been trying to get my points out, although he hasn't been giving me credit. And I talked to him about that kind of thing. And so he realizes that that was wrong. We had a great conversation about this kind of thing. And so there are people who are hostile. There are people in the press. There was a New Yorker writer who actually lied about his interview with me. Like I said, it's a real fight, and people are nasty. But we still have to be in the space, and I still have to treat people with dignity and respect until they show me differently. Okay, is that it? All right, let's go out and I hope you all have a nice, I hope you all enjoy your Sunday in a nice psychoactive way. Thank you.
Times like yeah, bad trips like yeah.
Yeah, true.
Just like your mother, and no matter how angry you get, you'll never be your father. I promise.
I'm just gonna like play around with this.
Yeah.